Okay, hello and welcome to this presentation on Overmind. So what we're looking at here is just a very simple Vue example. Now, Vue isn't actually my preference in frameworks. I'm typically a React developer, but I think Vue is so simplistic in the way it expresses like templates and state and all this stuff, so that it doesn't matter what you do, you will understand this. And what we see here is a simple counting application, like the counter example. Like this isn't very complex. And when we talk about state management, we usually talk about managing complexity, but we have to start somewhere. So what we're going to do here is that we are going to change this example into Overmind. And then we're going to talk about why we do that refactor. So what we see here is just a simple view which has a template with two buttons where one button decrements and another button increments, and we have the count. And then we have data, which is state, and we have methods to decrement and increment that count, and it automatically updates. Now, what we're going to do is rather import Overmind from Overmind. And we are going to create a new instance of Overmind. And what we can actually do here is just copy over the count, because in Overmind it's named state, not data. And then these methods here, they are called actions in Overmind. So let's see, actions. But these actions, they do not they don't use this. They rather get one argument, which is the configuration of your application. So we get state here, because we have state up here, and we also get state here. So we rather change the state from there instead. So now we have our application. We don't have the count anymore. So what we want to do is rather connect this Overmind instance to our view. And the way we do that is to create a connector. And this connector we actually get from a package called Overmind View. And you also have one for React, and you also have one for Angular. So we create a connect and we pass it to Overmind instance. And now we can actually connect any view inside your application. So let's refactor this a little bit. Let's call it a component instead. And then we move this over. Let's see. We have to do it like this. And then what we're going to do is to connect this component. So we just type connect. And what happens now is that we actually have access to the Overmind instance. So what we can do instead of pointing directly to decrement is that we say Overmind actions decrement, Overmind actions increment, and Overmind state count. So let's restart the application, and there we go. We are back to the same behavior. But the way we organize our code is a bit different. Because what we did is that we moved this state and these actions or methods outside of the components, outside of the view layer, meaning that we can connect any component with this state, and any component can actually change this state. And sometimes you do want to isolate state and logic inside a component, but more often than not, in my experience, you don't want that behavior. You want this to be moved outside, so your state doesn't depend on the components. And we're going to talk more about that very shortly, but I want to show you one more thing first. So what happened in the background here is that I'm running the Overmind developer tool. And this developer tool has access to everything that's happening inside your application. So for example, here we have the count, and you would have all the state of your application here. And then we have something called actions. And actions shows you whenever you trigger some action inside Overmind, you get information about what data was passed to that action, what did the action do, like what mutations did it do to the state. And also if you were doing some side effects, you would also see that, which we will show a little bit later. You also have access to the components. Now I didn't name my component, so it doesn't have a name. But you would see how many updates it has had due to changes to the state it depends on. And as we can see, it depends on the count state. So this is a very helpful tool as you develop your application. But now let's talk a little bit more about why we are doing this kind of separation. So, web application development is about defining, changing, and consuming state to produce a user experience. Overmind aims for a developer experience where that is all you focus on, reducing the orchestration of state management to a minimum, making you a happier and more productive developer. So to understand this, we have to kind of look through history a little bit. Because when we started making web applications, we didn't have that much complexity in the browser, because the server actually did all of the work. It was responsible for producing the state, and it put that state into a view, and that view produced the HTML, which was delivered to the client. And if the client wanted to change the state, it had to ask the server. But then we got this thing called Ajax. We had the possibility to talk to the server and get data and then dynamically update the browser. And this introduced state in the browser itself. And at least for me, I didn't think about state at all. I just thought about getting data and updating the UI. I didn't think about state management, but other people did. So we started getting these abstractions. One of them, the first one I know of, is Backbone, which created this abstraction where you have a template and you have the state and you have some methods for updating that template whenever the state changes. Now this was a huge leap forward, but it had some issues, and with more iterations, those issues were resolved, and it seems that we have landed on a concept now that everybody agrees on, and that concept is a component. So a component has state, and it produces a user interface, and it does that by transforming the state into the user interface. And then it gets interaction from the interface, user interface, and it produces some new state, which renders a new user interface, and it goes around and around. And this is a beautiful abstraction. It works really, really well, and it's composable, unlike the previous example we saw with Backbone. And as I said, all the frameworks kind of share this concept, Angular, Vue, React, and the others. And the components build up this structure, like this component structure, which actually is a reflection of your UI, like the HTML structure. But there are some challenges with this concept. One of those challenges is when you want your state to live beyond the lifetime of a component. Because when you attach state to a component, when that component unmounts and is removed, the state is also removed. So take, for example, you have a user component, and inside that user component you have some tabs, and you want to remember what tab you had opened when you go back and forth to this user page. Now, if you have that state inside the user page, then it will be gone when you move, for example, to the admin page in this case. So to fix this, we have to move that tab state up the component tree, and in this example to the app component. But the app component doesn't care about this state really, it's just kind of like helping out. And then we have a similar case where we have to think about, whenever we introduce state, we have to think about which component should be responsible for this state, so that the components that wants to look at that state can do so. So in this case, we again, we have like a user page and it fetches a user and looks at that user. But then we have this admin page on the left side, admin component, which also wants to look at the user. And that means that we need to move the user up to the component so that both the admin and the user component can access that user, and the app is responsible for delivering it. Now, this is a simple example, but as your application grows, you might have to pass that user down through several components to reach all the components that is interested in that state. And this creates friction. It's, in my opinion, not a good developer experience, and you lose track of what is your UI and what is your state. They live in different places. But you also have the case where you actually want to change the state. So for example, you might have a form, and the fields in that form are their own components, and they need to change the state on the top form component. So you have to pass down not only state, but you have to pass down functionality to change that state. And this has the same friction as passing state, because you might need to pass a function several components down. Or you might be using, like in Angular, you might be using events to notify the form component about a change on a field. No matter how you do it, it creates this kind of artificial hidden link between the components, and that just creates friction. So to summarize this, the way you structure your UI actually influences access to and lifetime of state. And that creates friction, because you have this one component structure that is responsible for both the state and the UI. And as long as those two structures align, it's a beautiful thing. But typically when it doesn't take too long, it creates, you kind of like have two different structures. You have one structure for your state, and then you have one structure for your UI. What Overmind does, and this is nothing new, like you have this concept already in all these frameworks, but what it does is that it puts your state and your logic outside of the components, so that you mainly use your components to render UI. And if you introduce state in your components, it is typically for that piece of UI you are producing, so you have that tight connection between UI and state. But any component can now look at the state inside Overmind, and it can trigger actions to change that state. So the way you can think about this is that you put your application state, the state you want to just live through your whole application session or user session, inside Overmind. But you still use component state. This is not about saying component state is bad. It's just at some point it starts creating friction. And that is when you want to use a solution like Overmind. So now let's look at some more code. And we're actually going to look at TypeScript now. But don't be scared. Overmind is built with TypeScript with the goal of reducing the TypeScript you need to write. So let's have a look. Okay, so now we have actually set up a new application, and it's actually written in TypeScript. If you haven't written TypeScript before, don't feel intimidated. Overmind is not written in TypeScript because you should write TypeScript. You can just use normal JavaScript. But if you choose to use TypeScript, it will be a really great experience because you actually write very little TypeScript yourself. You just get all the benefits. So what we're going to do now is just look at these files, and then we are going to write some logic. So first of all, let's have a look at the app component. And as you instantly can see, I'm importing React here instead of Vue. And that is just because React currently has better TypeScript support than Vue. React also has a concept that of this video is not quite ready yet. It should be out in a couple of weeks, which is called hooks. And this is being adopted also by Vue, and it it is becoming like a general programming pattern, but it creates like a really great way to express the connection between Overmind and a component, as we will see very soon. What we can also see here is that we have our main index file, which just renders out the component to our app element. And then we have this Overmind app folder. And instead of having our configuration created in one object, we split it up into different files. And this is to handle scalability. And as your application grows, you will even have multiple folders with each of them representing a part of your configuration, and then you bring it all together. But you can read more about that in documentation. So let's have a look at the actions file. It just has a simple action that doesn't do anything currently. And then we have this effects file. And we're going to talk more about that shortly, but currently it just has a placeholder object for our JSON placeholder effect. Then we have our state file, which defines the type for our posts, which has a title and a body. We define the type of the state, which has an isLoading posts boolean state and the posts array. And then we define our state with the actual values. Now, our index file now has a little bit more logic, because we are bringing in the state and the actions and the effects, and we put them into a configuration object. And then we use what we call implicit typing to just tell the Overmind library what configuration we are using for our app. You can also use explicit typing here if you don't feel comfortable doing it this way, but this will work for most applications. Then we instantiate our Overmind application and we create our hook. So what we're going to do now is implement our action, and we are actually going to run it when our app component mounts. So first of all, we want to define our effect. And we do that by simply adding a new method here, and we can call it whatever we want, but I want to call it getPosts, and I want it to be an async function. And I want this async function to return a promise of posts. So I just write that out, promise post, like this, and with some help from the editor here, we are importing the post type. So we're just saying that this method returns a promise of posts. And instead of using Axios here, we are going to just use fetch. And we go and we fetch the posts. Let's see. Copy link address like that. And then we return the JSON representation of those posts. Because you might, like your intuition might have told you that why don't you just go to the actions and just import Axios or use fetch directly. But this is a really important concept, an important separation. Because in your action, you only want to express actual application logic. You don't care about the low-level implementations of doing an HTTP request. It also ensures that your actions becomes more pure, meaning that they're easier to test. So let's see how this actually works now. You might remember that these actions receive the state, but they also receive effects. What we want to make sure of is that also this one is async. And let's just write out that we want our posts to load, and then we are going to await effects, JSON placeholder, get posts. We call that TypeScript is happy, and we say false. And now you got like a first-hand experience of seeing how TypeScript helps you. It knows about all the state and what is to be put into that state. It also knows about all your effects. And as you continue iterating on your application, adding more state, adding more effects, they will just be available to your actions instantly. Okay, so let's go to our component. And we are going to fire up this action when this component mounts. And to do that, we need to actually use a hook from React itself, which is called useEffect. And we are going to combine it with our useOvermind hook from Overmind. So what we're going to do here is first say we want to grab the state and the actions from equals useOvermind. So this is actually all you have to do to expose the state and the actions to components. And then we're going to use an effect. And we don't want this effect to run. And this is React effects, just to be clear. But we don't want these effects, this effect to run every time the component renders. So we pass it an empty array. So it only runs once. And what we want to run is actions load app. And we save that. And we don't really see anything, but we have our development tool. So what we can see here is that isLoadingPosts is false, and we can actually see that we already have all our posts here. By looking at the Actions tab, we can see that we first set the isLoadingPosts to true. We called JSON placeholder getPosts, and we received 100 posts. Then we set those posts, and then we set it to false. But nothing really happened here, because nothing is using this state yet. So let's change that. Let's first make sure that when we are loading the posts, we are just saying loading posts. But when we are not loading the posts, we want to actually display them. So we point to state, posts, we map over those. And let's create an li element here, and we can just say post title. And we're just going to use the index here for keying the elements. And this is the same concept you have in Angular and Vue as well. Let's save that, and suddenly we have some posts here. So let's just refresh, and we see the loading and we see the posts. And if we go to our development tool, we can now see that we have loaded the posts again, and now we're affecting one component. So that is effects in Overmind. And there is more to learn here. We also have concepts for deriving and memoizing state and things like that. But please go to the documentation to learn more about that. Thanks for following me through this introduction, and I hope you enjoy using Overmind.